Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. FODI started in 2009 and is the original disruptive ideas festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. It has been over 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and 22 years since Vladimir Putin came to power. Now in the throes of a Ukraine invasion, the Russian regime seems to combat any conflict with a disregard for internal opposition and external Western pressure. What are the strategic options for Western countries against this authoritarian superpower? Do military action or economic sanctions work, or do we need to consider less orthodox approaches? In this talk from 2014, in the wake of the Russian annexation of Crimea and the shooting down of MH17, Russian journalist and activist Masha Gessen and foreign policy analyst Tom Switzer test different ideas on how to deal with Putin. This session from 2014 is Putin.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today not to defend Vladimir Putin. I think that idea would be too dangerous for even this festival. Rather, I'm here today to explain Vladimir Putin, because only by understanding Putin's strategic motives do I think we have any real chance of resolving this crisis in the Ukraine, which has turned into the biggest conflict in the East-West relations since the end of the Cold War. Let me make it quite clear from the outset, lest anyone think I'm being heartless, that I have thought and prayed for the 300 souls who lost their lives in the Malaysian Airlines tragedy on July 17. No doubt it was an accident, but all the available evidence indicates that the Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine were responsible for downing that aircraft. And by failing to comply and cooperate with international investigators, those rebels have rightly been subjected to international condemnation. My goal here is to explain Putin. The conventional wisdom in the West, and this is reflected in the work of Masha's writings, blames almost entirely Russian aggression for the Ukraine standoff. The bear is on the prowl. Yesterday, Crimea. Today, eastern Ukraine. Tomorrow, Kiev. The next day, who knows? We are told that the West should beef up its military ties to Ukraine and further isolate Moscow before Putin establishes a greater Russia or a new Soviet empire. Many of my conservative friends, in fact, most of my conservative friends, Republicans in Washington, Tories in London, even Liberals, including Prime Minister Tony Abbott. I think it's probably one of the only times you might agree with Tony Abbott, Masha. They take a different view. Well, I disagree. Moscow's actions have largely been defensive, and Washington and Brussels have hardly been blameless. It was the West's efforts to peel Ukraine from what the Russians have long seen as their strategic orbit that was guaranteed to cause big trouble. And this was a prediction made time and again throughout the mid to late 1990s, when the architects, the intellectual architects of the Cold War doctrine, George Kennan and Paul Nitze, were making these very arguments back then. By expanding NATO and the European Union more or less up to the frontiers of the former Soviet Union, and by helping bring down a democratically elected pro-Russian, albeit thuggish government on February 22, the West has needlessly provoked the bear. Let's put this in some sort of historical context. We all too easily, in the internet and the 24/7 media age, think of the present without putting events in their proper historical context. Go back a quarter of a century ago. The Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell down, and an evil empire collapsed. This was a political miracle. After all, when empires collapse, brutality and bloodshed usually coincide. You think of the British departure from Kenya, Malaya, the Indian subcontinent, the French departure from Algeria and Vietnam, the Belgians from Congo, the Portuguese from Timor. Why then did the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan put it, collapse so peacefully? The answer lies in understanding an agreement, and it has been put forward by the then US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, that the Cold War ended by negotiation to the advantage of both Moscow and Washington. Both Presidents George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev made an implicit agreement that in exchange for a reunified Germany to be part of NATO, the West would not go east. That is, NATO would not expand into Russia's traditional sphere of influence. Now, of course, some political figures have questioned the nature of this agreement. What can't be denied is that Moscow, time and again, made it clear that as soon as Washington and Brussels started talking about NATO expansion in the mid-1990s, any proposals for the West to move east was acceptable and bound to cause big trouble. Boris Johnson, in particular, made it quite clear that he would not accept Ukraine and Georgia, strategically vital neighbours, into the Western orbit. And yet, throughout the 1990s, the United States, the indispensable nation, according to the then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the benign hegemon, according to the leading neoconservative thinkers Bob Kagan and Bill Kristol, used the unipolar moment, according to the distinguished columnist Charles Krauthammer, to extend security guarantees to almost anyone who asked for them. And so NATO expanded in 1999, then the Baltics in 2004, even proposed membership to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. The coup earlier this year that toppled Yanukovych, remember, a democratically elected pro-Russian government, further upset Russian sensitivities. In response, Putin took Crimea, the traditional home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which he feared would become a NATO base. And he has sought to destabilise Ukraine until its new anti-Russian government jettisoned plans to join the West. For Moscow, we need to remember Ukraine is a matter of intense strategic importance. Among other things, it covers a wide terrain of flat land that Napoleonic France, Wilhelmite Germany, Nazi Germany all crossed to attack Russia in the course of the last 2 centuries. Why would any Russian leader, Democrat or autocrat, tolerate a Cold War military pact to move into his country's backyard? Why would he acquiesce in a Western-backed coup to replace an ally with an anti-Russian regime in Kiev? Now, let's be clear. Putin's conduct has been illegal. It is easy and understandable to believe with the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, just on Friday when he said it was utterly reprehensible. But Putin's behaviour is hardly surprising. When great powers believe that their vital strategic interests are at stake, they will play hardball. They will play tooth and nail to secure those vital interests and doggedly guard what it regards as its sphere of influence. This is unfortunate, but the sad reality is this is the way the world works and always has. Imagine how Washington would respond, and I'm a great admirer of the United States in so many ways, but imagine how Washington would respond if Russia signed up Panama in a military pact, put rockets and missiles in Cuba, or helped bring down a democratically elected pro-US government in Mexico. It was inevitable that Putin would push back somewhere. But if Putin were the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, as hawks such as Hillary Clinton and Zib Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, suggest, where were the signs of the Kremlin's intentions to invade Crimea before the downfall of the pro-Russian Yanukovych government on February 22? It was this event that sparked Putin's military incursion in the Ukrainian peninsula, which I said is the traditional home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So what then should the West do? My view is that for the West to further punish and isolate Moscow and escalate military support to Ukraine is fraught with danger. Russia is a declining power, but it has, remember, a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. And if made desperate and humiliated further, it may react in the way that a cornered, wounded animal might. Strident talk about banning Putin from the G20 in Brisbane, which the Labor opposition leader Bill Shorten has suggested, will only backfire against the West. The point of such institutions is not that they are a reward for conformity or obliging behaviour, but that they provide a means to deal with common challenges. Moscow's help is needed in Iran, Afghanistan. Just this year ago, exactly, Putin helped Obama and Cameron, who were humiliated in their own legislatures when the Congress and the Commons rejected Cameron's and Obama's pleas for military authorisation against Assad. Putin came in to say, I will help Syria disband its chemical and biological weapons. And frankly, in light of the way that the strategic battles are taking place in Syria, perhaps Putin was right when he said that Assad was someone we'd better do business with, otherwise we'll struggle to contain the ISIS threat in Syria. I think punishing further Russia will merely drive Moscow further into China's hands, which is hardly in America's interests. At a time when Americans are tired of the world, they're suffering from foreign policy fatigue. We have opinion polls that show that more than 50% of the American people believe the country should mind their own business internationally. Why on earth would Washington pick a fight over a region where no US army has even fought before? Rather than extend economic sanctions against Russia and boost military support to Ukraine, I believe our leaders should tone down their bombast and understand the motives for Putin's conduct. As he reiterated just yesterday, he wants to force terms built around political changes in Ukraine that would weaken the central government authority in Kiev and ensure that Ukraine cannot be part of the West. His message, in essence, is get out of my face, get out of my space, or my country will continue to wreck Ukraine. These specific and limited conditions, as it happens, are not dissimilar to a remedy proposed by Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, still writing eloquently, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal on Friday, 91 years of age. And my friend, John Mearsheimer, the Distinguished Professor of International Relations at Chicago University, who is the author of a very important article in the new issue of the New York-based Foreign Affairs magazine. Their argument is that the West should reject any moves to integrate Ukraine into NATO or the European Union. Make Ukraine, if you like, a neutral buffer state akin to Austria during the Cold War. And call on President Petro Poroshenko, Ukraine's leader, to respect minority rights of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Failing that, expect Putin to continue to play hardball. Now, I'm a friend of the Ukrainian people. I'm not an adversary. The policy I'm outlining, which is the Kissinger-Mearsheimer view, is designed to do good for Ukrainians of all stripes and put an end to this present nightmare. My opponent's solution, and I put Masha in this camp, will only make the situation in Ukraine worse, which is hardly in the interests of the Ukrainian people. So in conclusion, the West faces a choice here. It can continue to punish and isolate Moscow, which is bound to exacerbate East-West relations and in the process inflict massive pain on the Ukrainian people, or it can adopt the remedy I've outlined here today. Work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine that does not threaten Russia, make it a buffer state, and that allows the US and its allies to repair their relations with Moscow. With this approach, all sides, the Americans, the West, Russia, and Ukraine, will win. But if Washington and Brussels continue to cling to policies that caused the crisis in the first place, all sides fail. The choice, you would think, is obvious. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I want to get some reaction now to what Tom has had to say from Masha, and then we can have a broader discussion about Putin and what Putin looks like.
Thank you. So that was interesting. I'm not sure actually why you chose to call me somebody who's done so much for gay and lesbian rights in the world. I, in fact, have been a political journalist in Russia for more than 20 years and an open lesbian, and because of my lesbianism was forced to leave the country late last year. But I think my political journalism is much more relevant, and the fact that I've been a Putin biographer for many years is much more relevant to this discussion. I am, however, now going to be a totally humorless lesbian. And I found what I heard to be deeply distasteful and immoral. Because, and let's just go, before we get to the main argument, let's go down sort of the list of assertions. One is funny, which is that Putin has strategic motives. Putin, as I think has been decisively shown by many people, including me, has no strategic motives. He is a man incapable of strategic thinking. He is a man with a planning horizon of 6 weeks. You may wonder where I get this exact figure of 6 weeks. I'll tell you. When Russia was going to hold the Sochi Olympics, everybody who thinks about this sort of thing in the world expected Russia to clean up its act on human rights in advance of the Olympics, so probably in the fall of last year. Because everyone had done it. China had gone so far as to abolish the death penalty before the Olympics, only to bring it back as soon as it was over. But Russia didn't. Russia kept doing outrageous stuff. Russia kidnapped 30 international activists, 30 Greenpeace activists in international waters in September before the February Olympics. It's like Russia forgot that the rest of the world was watching and that the success of Putin's big party may depend on its actions. In December, Russia remembered that when one Western leader after another backed out of attending the Olympics. And so on December 21st and 23rd, respectively, Putin released some high-profile political prisoners. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the women of Pussy Riot, and the 30 kidnapped Greenpeace activists who'd been seized in international waters. On the very same day that the activists of Pussy Riot were being released, an environmental activist named Evgeny Vitishko was sentenced to 3 years in prison for protesting environmental violations during the Sochi Olympics. So Russia wasn't changing what it was doing, but it was trying to clean up its act in a desperate last-minute attempt to get people to come to the Olympics. The distance between those releases and the Olympics was 6 weeks, which is where I get my figure. Putin's planning horizon is 6 weeks. He does not engage in strategic thinking. The decision to invade the Crimea, and on this point I partly agree with you, the decision to invade the Crimea was made 2 days before the Crimea was invaded. This is how the Kremlin works. But to base your argument on the idea that Putin has strategic motives to which the West needs to respond is a fallacy. I also want to take extreme exception to your statement that you're not heartless because you grieved for the 300 souls who died in Malaysian Flight 17. What about the thousands of Ukrainian citizens who had died before that? And the hundreds of Russian soldiers who have died, who were sent, many of them, without knowing where they were going, without knowing where they were. Some of them, as we find out now, were told by their commanders that they were in training exercises on Russian territory until they realized they were shooting at people. People are dying. This is a real war. And this is where we get to the crux of the matter. The argument that you have made basically treats Ukraine, and Russia really, as though they had no agency of their own, as though they didn't really exist, as though the West creates Putin out of thin air and creates his policies, and it is only the West's actions that lead to wars or stop wars. That is not true. The Ukrainian people have their own agency and have made their preferences perfectly clear. The reason that NATO was expanding toward Ukraine is because the Ukrainian people wanted it there, because they have asked for NATO's protection, just as the Baltic states asked for NATO's protection. And I know that people in the 3 Baltic states that have joined NATO, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are feeling a lot more secure these days in the face of Russian aggression than Finland, which hasn't joined NATO, but which has just started talking about joining NATO while seeing the way that Russia is acting. The same goes for this idea that there was a coup, a Western-backed coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of Ukraine. This was not a coup. This was revolution. And the way this worked was that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians came out into the streets after Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, backed out at the last minute on an agreement to sign a partnership agreement with the European Union. Why did Yanukovych back out? Because Putin bought Yanukovych for $15 million. I mean, this is not some sort of secret information. There was a wonderful article in the magazine Foreign Policy when that happened, and the headline was brilliant. Putin just bought a country, why don't we care? Well, the Ukrainians cared, and the Ukrainians came out into the streets and started protesting. And both Yanukovych and the Kremlin expected the Ukrainians to protest for a while and leave, just as Russians had done when they were protesting. There's a significant difference, however, between Russia, which has been an authoritarian state for 15 years now, and Ukraine, which has been a country with a transitional form of government for the last 20 years. A transitional form of government means that it's no longer an authoritarian state and is not yet a democracy. It has elements of both, it has democratic institutions, and it is those democratic institutions that have stepped in both times that Ukraine was in crisis, in 2004 during the so-called Orange Revolution, and this year during the 2014 revolution. So Yanukovych waited for people to disband, people did not disband, and then he opened fire on them. And after more than 100 people were killed in Maidan, in Independence Square in Kiev, the Ukrainian parliament, the elected Ukrainian parliament, deposed the president. This is not a coup. This is a democratic institution kicking in when other democratic institutions are failing, when the people demand change. That's what happened in Ukraine. And to call it a Western-backed coup is once again to discount the opinion, the will of the people of Ukraine, which is perfectly clear. I find the question is posed, why would Putin tolerate something in his backyard? Why would Putin acquiesce to something in his backyard? To be, again, distasteful and in a way, it's very politically primitive. I mean, it's not his backyard. He is not being asked to tolerate it. It's not his country. It's another state. And, but to make this point a little bit more nuanced, what we have seen in the 1990s and 2000s is basically countries that had been part of the Soviet Union entering to some more successfully, some less successfully, post-imperial era, and Russia refusing resolutely to become a post-imperial state. Russia refusing to view its new neighbors as neighbors, rather than as part of its own sphere of influence, and in fact, part of its eminent domain. And so in that sense, the question, where were the signs that Putin was going to invade Crimea before he actually invaded Crimea, that question is disingenuous. The signs were all over the place. The writing was on the wall. Russia was consistently refusing to become a post-imperial state. Russia was returning, in fact, under Putin increasingly, and especially in the last 2.5 years, since Putin came back into office, was returning to a very aggressive imperial rhetoric. And so it was very clear that when the opportunity presented itself, Russia would invade a neighboring country. It didn't have to be Ukraine, it could have been something else. But Russia was going to expand. In fact, Russia had already done it in 2008. Russia had annexed a part of Georgia, something that the West closed its eyes to. Well, it didn't. I shouldn't say it closed its eyes to it. François Hollande, the president of France, which at the time was heading the European Union, actually traveled to Moscow and put the European stamp of approval on the annexation of South Ossetia by Russia. So that was a sign that Russia would invade the Crimea. So finally, one more thing. This is a small point, but just to the point of Putin being a good guy who helped Cameron and Obama when they were embarrassed last year by intervening with Assad, and that worked out really well. Come on, is this a joke? Putin walked in, hijacked the debate, seeing an opportunity. Putin is an opportunistic politician. He is very good at this stuff. He's very good at short-term stuff. He's very good at doing things like annexing the Crimea or hijacking the debate on Syria. And I find the disregard for the hundreds of thousands, we're not talking thousands, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Syrians who have died since Putin's highly successful intervention, to be just absolutely mind-boggling. Well, at least he helped Cameron and Obama save face. Getting to the biggest question, what should the West do? Now that I have destroyed my opponent's argument. That is actually the simplest part of the question, weird as it sounds, right? Let's talk about what my opponent suggested, that basically the West should do nothing. The West should sort of let Russia keep Ukraine and promise to back off, promise to not listen to the pleas of the Ukrainian people for NATO expansion. Well, I want to say it again. That's worked out really well. That is basically the line that the West has followed for the last, how long has it been? 6 months since Putin invaded Ukraine. And that's really kept him at bay, hasn't it? That's kept him from escalating. No, Putin sees the West as weak. Putin sees the inaction at every step of the way as further invitation to escalate the aggression. There are good reasons, from Putin's point of view, there are good reasons why he has to do this. He has to escalate because this war has really boosted his popularity. It has really changed the political equation in Russia. It has changed his personal political equation. For the first 12 years of his rule, Putin was a post-ideological president who basically mongered in Soviet nostalgia. For the last 2.5 years, he's been finding his ideological feet. It's been a pretty scary thing to observe. It's this idea of Russia as a separate civilization, a civilization based on traditional values, Russia having a unique role in the world, that to protect traditional values, to resist the West's expansion with its advocacy of homosexuality, which just some examples of who Russians think they're fighting in Ukraine. They're fighting American homo-fascists. They're fighting the expansion of gay Europa. That's a word. When the State Duma was passing its first resolution on Ukraine in December of last year, the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations said, we have to understand the gravity of the situation. If this partnership with the EU takes place, we're going to see the expansion of the gay sphere of influence. Right? So that's, that ideology has really taken hold, this idea that Russia has a civilizational mission and that Russia protects traditional values. And once that ideology became the ideology behind the war, Putin's popularity really skyrocketed. That's very handy because the Russian economy was stalling even before the war began, because Putin needed people to mobilize, and Putin needed a reason to mobilize the economy. So that his perceived popularity would be greater. So he needs to escalate for that reason. So he will take any excuse to escalate. The West's inaction, as has been shown, will lead him to escalate. Severe economic sanctions will certainly lead him to escalate because they will necessitate further mobilization of the economy and of the population. And if there were a military response, which is not on the table, but if there were a military response, of course he would escalate, because that would also require mobilization. That would be handy. So Putin is going to escalate no matter what, in a way that poses, that's a dead-end situation. There's no solution to this. On the other hand, that means there's no room here for the politics of realism. There is nothing the West can actually do that will make Putin change his mind. And that, in fact, has been a fallacy even behind the sanctions, which I support. Right? The sanctions have been insufficient, and part of the reason they have been insufficient is because there's this idea that if sanctions are imposed, and Putin understands that they will get worse if he escalates, then that will change something. It will not change anything, because it is impossible to change the course that he has quite consciously chosen for himself. And he has put himself on a course that is unchangeable. I mean, the only way that he can stop what he is doing is by leaving office, and he does not plan to do that in his lifetime. So, so if there's nothing to be done strategically, if there is no place for realpolitik, the only thing that we can talk about is a moral response. It is immoral to associate with a dictator. It is immoral to enter into tactical or strategic alliances with a dictator. It is immoral for this country to host Vladimir Putin, who has been killing people and who has been annexing parts of neighboring countries for the G20 summit, and to treat him as though he were one of the other world leaders and had all the rights and respect afforded that. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. Well, a lot there to discuss. I want to first of all put it to Tom. The initial comments from Masha there, that essentially this is a distasteful and offensive argument because it repudiates the desires, the democratic desires of the people of Ukraine, and insults the loss of life of people there, not just there, but by extension in Syria with Putin's support of the Assad regime and the Australians who died in MH17. What's your response to that? The moral argument.
I think this is the most profound counter-argument to the thesis that I've put forward. What about the rights of the Ukrainians? They are, after all, an independent people since the collapse of the Soviet Union. What about their rights to self-determination? That's right. And indeed, Tony Abbott made this point the other day when he argued that you can't have an international order if might is right. The sad reality is, though, that whether we like it or not, might often does make right from the view of a great power. A sphere of influence is a key characteristic of a great power. They will fight tooth and nail to protect what they see as their core vital interests. And frankly, no nation has been more adamant about protecting their sphere of influence than the United States. Did the Cubans have a right to form a military alliance with the Soviets in the early 1960s? Now, I'm worried because I suspect those people were probably sympathetic to the Soviet Union at the time. I'm not sure. But I certainly was a Cold Warrior. But I think the Americans were right. They were absolutely right. Ike, Jack Kennedy were right to be concerned that the Soviets were on the cusp of bringing nuclear weapons on America's doorstep, forming a military alliance with the Cold War foe. And let's remember, the revolution in '59, Castro was in power. On several occasions, the Americans tried to assassinate Castro. And as we know, ever since, the United States has maintained a very tough economic embargo. So the point is, just quickly, the point is, great powers, and of course America and Russia are hardly alone, history is littered with examples of great powers protecting its sphere of influence.
Tom,
Russia's no different.
This is not the context of the Cold War anymore, and to the extent that you've mounted the argument that Russia is cornered, I think you made the analogy there where the cornered animal will strike out. There's also a country that post the collapse of the Soviet regime was offered the Soviet seat at the UN Security Council, that was brought into the World Trade Organization, that has been given the Olympics, that has been given the World Cup soccer. This is not necessarily a country that has been ostracized and isolated, but a country that is rejected the entreaties of the West.
Yep, good points. They certainly have made it quite clear, Yeltsin, Putin, the broad cross-section of the Russian people, not everyone in Russia, but the broad cross-section, feel that their strategic sensibilities are not being taken seriously by the West by expanding NATO. I mentioned John Mearsheimer, a very good piece in Foreign Affairs. There's another good article on the same issue, looking at recently released historical documents between the Soviets and the Americans in Germany in 1990. And there was an agreement between Bush and Gorbachev that in exchange for a unified NATO, unified Germany as part of NATO, the West would not go east. And Bush, you may recall, was very nervous about the collapse of the Soviet Empire. We hear a different story today, which brings me to my second point, that the end of the Cold War was really the triumph of the West. The end of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it. You know, the end point of humankind's ideological evolution, the universalization of Western liberal democracy. The end of history. This was the narrative. And the narrative in Washington throughout the course of the 90s, first under Clinton and then under Bush, was that the United States, as the sole remaining superpower, had a special role to impose its will and leadership across the globe. And part of that vision meant expanding NATO east. Now, it is true that from the perspective of the United Nations, Wilsonian idealism, a 21st century world, we keep hearing this from the Secretary of State, John Kerry, we live in a 21st century world, Russia's conduct is completely unacceptable. But what Putin is showing here is the resurgence of old-fashioned power politics. Just because we've had more interdependency and globalisation doesn't mean the great powers still play hardball when their vital national interests are at stake. So I would suggest to the broad theme here is that what we've seen in the course of the last 20 or so years, not the end of history, but really the resurgence of old-style power politics.
Masha, Tom depicts Russia still as a great power, and this is great power politics, but is this more a case of a weakened power, a weakened state, acting defensively and belligerently? This is not a great power expressing itself, but coming from a position of weakness.
It's both. I mean, Russia is a greatly weakened state, a state that feels that it was humiliated by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and by the position that it occupied in the world in the 1990s. It does feel, and this is one place where I almost agree with you. I think that there was a huge mistake made in 1999 when NATO started bombing Yugoslavia without even paying lip service to discussing this with the Russians. The bombing of Yugoslavia began while the then Prime Minister of Russia, Yevgeny Primakov, was on his way to meet with Bush. And he turned his plane around over the Atlantic when he heard that the bombing had started and flew back to Moscow. And that was a turning point in Russian politics. It didn't create Putin. It enabled a kind of politics of nationalism and resurgent imperialist rhetoric that I think could have been avoidable. But ultimately, it's a country that never came around to a new identity as a non-superpower, that over the last 15 years has been feeling more and more humiliation rather than being in the process of coming to terms with this, and is now lashing out.
So given that, the sense of humiliation that you've sketched there and the search for an identity that Putin perhaps represents, and certainly if you look at the opinion polls, the more that he seems to stand up to the West, the more popular he becomes. Does that then not go to Tom's thesis that the West's ambition to extend the reach of NATO, to meddle in the sphere of influence of Putin, has precisely delivered us to this point?
Well, no, because first of all, I think that's it's oversimplistic. I also think it sort of tries to measure Russia by using tools that are not applicable to an authoritarian state. You cannot measure public opinion in an authoritarian state. There is a huge amount of support for the war in Russia, and that is true of any country that has started a war. Right? Usually there's a resurgence in popularity for any leader, especially if the leader is able to communicate to the country that the war is caused by the fact that the country is under siege. You wait a couple of years, people start to understand that the conflict has dragged on, that their own children, their own livelihood are at stake, and the popularity starts to wane. But at the beginning of a war, you always see this kind of picture. You also always see this kind of overwhelming support for the leader in an authoritarian state. What we know about it, though, is that it's incredibly fickle, because part of the way that people survive in an authoritarian state is by being very sensitive to the winds of change. And that's why we have seen Arab Spring. We have countries where opinion polls also showed overwhelming support for the government until they didn't the next day.
Well, one of the strong arguments, Tom, that Masha made, and that is that if the politics of Putin won't change, regardless of what the West may do or not do, then is there not just a moral argument here that we're not going to change him by sanctions necessarily, by being isolated or ostracised, by trying to understand Putin is not going to change his behaviour. Is there not a moral line in the sand?
You can talk about moral lines in the sand, but ultimately it comes down to national interests. And for Russia, Ukraine is widely seen as a matter of intense strategic importance. It always has been.
But as much as said, it is not theirs.
Yeah, right, but it's in their sphere of influence, and this is the nature of great power politics. I think another key point that you've partly touched on, and we've overlooked this in this discussion, is the resolve of NATO, Western Europe and the United States especially. Even at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviets intervened in the Hungarian uprising in '56, the Czechoslovakia dispute in '68, those cold warriors, Dwight Eisenhower and LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, were pretty cautious. Likewise, in '81, with the Polish Solidarity, when the communists crushed that, Ronald Reagan, of all people, was pretty cautious. And even today, although John Kerry says all options are on the table, the United States is not going to commit ground troops into Ukraine. They're not. Even John McCain, the Republican hawk, who's never known a war he hasn't supported, even John McCain says there are no ground troops on the cards. So in that regard, why on earth would the West make threats and commitments that they're unwilling and unable to honour, particularly when they're dealing with a country that is not part of their core strategic interests?
Does that then, though, not leave Ukraine to the mercy of Putin?
Well, look, I think the compromise here...
To do nothing.
Look, clearly Ukraine is a bitterly divided country. There is a significant segment, although they're a minority, increasingly so now that Crimea is part of Ukraine. And, it's quite conceivable that Putin has indeed miscalculated. By taking Crimea, he limits the Russian influence in non-Crimea Ukraine. That's conceivable. But nevertheless, there's a significant segment of ethnic Russians who do live in Ukraine. And he's clearly, if you read his speeches, he's making it clear that he wants Ukraine to be a buffer state and that the ethnic Russians' minority rights are protected.
That's an interesting
point. That's a key point.
I want to put to Masha as well, the argument that this is thwarting Ukrainian destiny and the will of Ukrainian people, that it was their efforts that led to the overthrow of Yanukovych, and they went to the street and they rejected his realignment with Russia, as you say, that was bought for the $15 billion that Putin offered him. But to what extent can we talk about that level of unity, and to what extent is Ukraine just not a fractured country, that we will end up with a West Ukraine and East Ukraine, and within that Eastern Ukraine, Putin will have a sphere of influence, and a legitimate sphere of influence, given the ethnic Russians who live there and their sense of being persecuted by Ukrainian nationalists? Well,
first of all, the Ukrainian Revolution was actually remarkable for how it brought together disparate forces.
But it hasn't held, has it? It hasn't held in the sense that there have been those who have rejected that and wanted to realign themselves with Russia.
We don't know that. I mean, the people who had the so-called rebels, which is a total misnomer. It's basically Kremlin language. These are Russian-funded, Russian-trained, Russian citizens who are fighting on Ukrainian territory. Why are we calling them Ukrainian rebels? We have no basis for saying that it hasn't held, right? That's one thing. The other thing is it is up to Ukraine to figure out how it can create harmony among all its people. It is not up to Russia.
I want to just go to, before we open up to discussion, because there are a lot of people here and I'm sure there are a lot of questions to be asked, but what we have you here, your book was fascinating for the sketch of the pathology of Putin. how much of the boy is in the man. Can we just talk to that? The Putin persona, the Putin psychology, how much of that was framed by his experiences growing up, and later we'll get to his time when he was serving in Dresden in East Germany. But how much of the boy has made the man?
I would reframe that a little bit, because I think that there are lots of boys who grew up in tough circumstances who didn't, grow up to invade Crimea. But it is remarkable when Putin talks about his life and when the stories that he chooses. And Putin is a unique politician in that until he came to the world stage, no one knew who he was. He had no public record. He'd been a KGB agent all his life. So his entire life was shrouded in secrecy. And there he was, the head of a great country, with the opportunity to tell people who he was. And what he chose to tell people was that he was a thug. His entire narrative of his young life is based on times that he got into fights. And the self-portrait that he paints is the picture of an aggressive, vengeful man who has trouble controlling his temper and who holds grudges.
And this is an image he has wanted to project.
This is an image he has communicated. He had a choice. I mean, he didn't have a public record.
His years serving in Dresden were interesting for two things. One, that for all of his dream about the glory of the KGB and the role that he could play, it was a fairly mundane existence. And secondly, he missed a critical moment of Russian history. First of all, go to what he did as a KGB agent.
He was a paper pusher.
Not the thuggish image he wants to present, no.
That is very true. The KGB was an overstuffed organization by the time, overstaffed and overstuffed, by the time that it came to its official end in 1991. It had a huge number of agents, staff, and freelance in Russia and in Eastern Europe, who were collecting all sorts of information, mostly based on open sources, largely press clippings, who were writing copious reports, which nobody read. And Putin was one of the many people who essentially had that job. He had dreamed of being in the KGB. He had first tried to volunteer as a teenager, then he was finally...
And his father had been...
And his father had been in the KGB, and in the NKVD, which was the precursor. He was finally drafted into the KGB after he graduated from the law department of Leningrad University. He served, basically in a desk job in Leningrad for a few years. Then he was finally accepted into a foreign intelligence school. He was taught German. He was very much hoping for an appointment, for an assignment in Western Germany, and instead he got an assignment in East Germany, and in Dresden, not even in Berlin. It was a total backwater. And his assignment was to recruit potential informants in West Berlin while in Dresden. So he had two ways to do that. One was through West German radicals who regularly came to Dresden to communicate with them, and who were playing their own game. And the other one was through Latin American students at Dresden colleges who may have Latin American friends who were students at West Berlin colleges who may have American friends who were serving in the U.S. military. So his greatest accomplishment as a KGB agent in Dresden appears to have been buying for, I think, 200 or 250 Deutschmarks, a 700-page non-classified manual off of a U.S. soldier in West Berlin.
So I think you've once described this as more Walter Mitty than James Bond.
I think that's fair. But yeah, I just want to pick up on the point you made
and the second
very
point,
quickly.
the years that he spent out, which were critical years in Russia, and he arrives back to a Russia that has changed dramatically, and he's missed it.
Yes, I think that is absolutely key, because what happened in Russia in the late 1980s was incredible. I mean, it was uplifting, it was inspiring, it was mind-blowing. It was when censorship was gradually lifted, when all sorts of social movements took shape, when people started talking to each other and talking to the state about things that were really, really important. From where Putin sat in Dresden, it looked like chaos. And it also looked like a betrayal. He was there to serve a great country.
Hence his comment that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest political tragedy of the 20th century.
The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, yes. And then finally he felt he really was sort of left to his own devices in Dresden as the Soviet Union pulled out of East Germany. And he left essentially in disgrace, feeling like he had been let down. He had honorably done the job that he was assigned, as unglamorous as it was, for this glamorous institution. And nobody had any respect for that back in the Soviet Union.
Tom? Masha or Stan, tell the story for the audience about Putin and his dealings with Angela Merkel.
Oh, yeah, it's a story that I'd heard just recently, and it really went to the pathology, I think, of Vladimir Putin, and having been informed by Masha's excellent book. Angela Merkel had been attacked quite viciously by a dog when she was a young girl. And she came to Moscow for a meeting with Putin. They sat in the huge room that they were sitting in, 2 chairs. As she sat, Putin called one of his dogs into the room, a large, Alsatian or something, that came in and circled her and sat at his feet the entire meeting, which just goes to the way that he likes to play intimidating politics, the thuggish image that he likes to project. And before we go to questions from the audience, I want to put this to you, Tom, that rather than see this as Russia being encircled by the West, rather than see this as a great power politics or a Russian problem, are we just not pandering to the pathology, a pathological, thuggish leader? This is not about Russia. This is about Putin. Why should we bend to that sort of thuggish behaviour?
Well, I'm glad you told that story, because it gave me an opportunity to say that, again, I'm not defending this thug. That kind of behaviour is really quite offensive in so many ways.
But so is invading a country and killing people.
These are complicated, as I've tried to explain. You talk about Putin's stories. One of the stories he likes to tell is that when he was a kid in an apartment complex, he used to have this game by himself where he'd get these rats. Every day he'd get a rat and he'd let the rat loose and he'd chase the rat and he'd try to kill it. Pretty disgusting sort of thing to do as a young kid. But one day he got bitten badly. The rat was cornered and it lashed back out at Putin. And Putin's never forgotten that. And I think the story here is that even if we live in a 21st century world, great powers like Russia still feel very insecure about their near abroad. And he's making it clear, get out of my space, get out of my face, I won't provoke. Now, this is really, when you think about it, to a lesser extent, what we're seeing right now, unfortunately, in the South China Sea. When great powers rise, and I think Russia is a declining great power, but when great powers like China rise, it's understandable that their national interests will grow as their power increases. Look, they seek a sphere of influence, and the tragedy of diplomacy is how do you accommodate the rise of great powers, but also how do you accommodate the decline of great powers. Again, I want to emphasise this point. We're talking about a country here with a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Including the nuclear weapons that used to belong to Ukraine.
Well, indeed. And what a stupid mistake that was for the Ukrainians to sign that agreement in 1994, because it merely allowed the Russians to go in.
Yeah.
Again, fooling the folly of international law on these issues.
Okay, we have a lot of people here, and this is a fascinating subject, a fascinating man, abhorrent as some may see him, and obviously there are people here very motivated by recent geopolitical events and the tragedy that has touched Australia, and I'm sure there are so many questions you'd like to put. If you could, it's very difficult to see you from here because of the lights, but there are microphones strategically placed around the room at the front here. Are there any at the back? Any microphones? No, just at the front. 2 microphones here. If you'd like to make your way, and we can get through as many questions as we possibly can, addressed to either Tom or Masha. Please try to keep them as brief as possible. We can, and to questions rather than comments, so we can get a reaction and try to get through as many as possible. Please, sir.
I think we're all agreed that Putin's a bit of work. Let's put that aside for 1 minute. But also remember that NATO is not Oxfam. NATO was set up as a militaristic, union of states against the Soviet Union, and that's why it exists today. So why should the Soviet Union, Masha, feel very happy about its borders being surrounded by NATO nations where Germany and Britain and America can move their troops willy-nilly through those nations should they wish. I think any nation deserves a right to feel emotionally secure and, as Tom points out, at best be surrounded by neutral-type states.
Masha, I think the point you made before was that this is actually not Russia, it's Ukraine.
Right. Two things. First of all, it's not the Soviet Union, it's Russia. And second of all, and that's important. And second of all, let's not talk about whether Moscow should feel happy. Moscow should be forced to acknowledge the reality that it has as its neighbors other independent countries that are free to choose their alliances. And Ukraine has chosen to ally itself with the West because it feels threatened by Russia. And I don't think we should be surprised that it feels threatened by Russia.
Yeah, I get back to that period in the early 1990s. We all too often forget this, a very important period. I think there's a conventional wisdom that's emerged, quite understandably, that with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, this was the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of the Soviet Empire was a logical process 2 years later. In 1990 and 1991, all the available evidence makes it quite clear that President Bush Sr., and he was attacked from both right and left in Washington on this question, his goal was to actually help prop up the Soviet Union. I mean, you've read Brent Scowcroft, his National Security Advisor, Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleberger, all the heavy hitters in this administration were very nervous about the prospects of the collapse of an empire. And in many respects, these thoughts were at odds with much of the American rhetoric of American presidents from Truman right through to Reagan. I think Nixon and Gerald Ford were a bit different, but nevertheless, Bush came from that old realist mindset that the thought of the breakdown of the evil empire was fraught with the danger of unintended consequences. And you only have to look at the collapse of other empires in world history, as I gave you those examples, to realise that often when these brutal tyrants or just empires or colonial powers end their possession of power, it often coincides with bloodshed and brutality. So this was a really big fear, and in fact, in August 1, 1991, President Bush Sr. went to Kiev and he lectured the Ukrainians. And he said, independence would amount to, quote, suicidal nationalisms. So this was a very real fear in Washington and in Brussels that if the Soviet Union collapsed, it could lead to a lot of brutality. Now, let's remember, we've had many times in the history of the Soviet Empire where we had spring times of reform, East Germany, East Berlin in 1953, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 68, Polish Solidarity in 81, and they met a summer of repression. So there was every reason to think, from Bush's perspective, that the Soviets would go down and fight tooth and nail and cause a lot of mischief. They didn't. There was an implicit agreement between Bush and Gorbachev. That deal was repudiated by Clinton, Bush Jr., and arguably Obama.
Wait. I have to... Well, I mean, first of all, I'm glad you brought up another instance of the absolute failure and misorientation of so-called realist politics. But also, the reason the deal between Bush and Gorbachev was not repudiated by Clinton. Gorbachev was deposed, and that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. No, Yeltsin was not...
I can provide many quotes from Boris Yeltsin throughout the mid to late 1990s where he made it absolutely clear that NATO expansion was not on the cards. And in fact, President Clinton originally put forward a proposal called Partnership for Peace, which would include Russia as part of NATO, which was a nonsense idea from all the countries in Eastern and Central Europe, so that never went anywhere. But starting in the mid-1990s, Clinton, Albright, Perry, and admittedly this was broadly a bipartisan policy in Washington, pushed NATO expansion, and I could turn to any press statement, any press conference with Yeltsin and Clinton where Yeltsin made it clear NATO expansion was going to cause big trouble. And by the way, this was a view put forward by many prominent thinkers in America at the time. I mentioned George Kennan, the intellectual architect of the containment doctrine, Paul Nitze, many other prominent conservatives and liberals. One of them happens to be in the audience tonight, my good friend Owen Harris, who is the 2003 Boyer lecturer, staunch Cold Warrior, but throughout the course of the mid to late 1990s, he made it very clear NATO expansion would cause big trouble, and that's what's happened.
Response, Masha?
No, I was just pointing out that it had nothing to do with Gorbachev and Bush. The politics
Because
of the
the agreement
1990s.
was betrayed.
I'm sorry?
The agreement was betrayed.
The agreement was annulled by the fact that Gorbachev was deposed.
Yeah, but virtually every Russian would have agreed with Gorbachev's agreement. Are you saying the Gorbachev successors wanted NATO expansion?
No, I'm not saying they wanted NATO expansion. I'm saying that Russia's non-aggression toward its neighbors had to do with the post-imperial politics that Yeltsin pursued, and did not have to do with any promises that Gorbachev, who'd been deposed, had made to Bush.
Okay. Sir, please.
I almost forgot what I want to ask.
That's the hallmark of a good conversation.
Such a good discussion. Anyhow, Masha, I would like to ask you, hypothetically speaking, what if Mr. Putin will decide to quit the politics one day?
That is hypothetical.
Is there any workable opposition, decent opposition? In Australia, we're saying fair dinkum ones, to replace him?
I hate those kinds of hypotheticals. He's not going to decide to quit politics. That's the reason. One of the reasons we're talking about him today. And so that kind of shifting the conversation is actually horribly misleading. One of the reasons that we're talking about Putin today is that he is never going to leave office voluntarily. One of the ways in which he has ensured that he will be able to stay in office indefinitely is by destroying all public conversation, all public space, and taking over all media in the country. Of course, there's no opposition under those conditions. It is mortally dangerous to be a part of the opposition. It is also technically impossible when people cannot communicate among themselves, when people cannot choose in an open forum a possible alternative leader. So no, until there is regime change, there will be no viable opposition. And there's not going to be regime change until there's viable opposition.
If we're left with Putin as a reality then, what does that say to Tom's argument that we need to find a way to deal with the reality of Putin that is not devastatingly bloody?
No, I have no objection to that argument. I'm just saying that appeasing Putin has not worked at all.
Is confronting him going to work?
I think confronting him is at least possibly will bring the end of the regime a little bit closer. It is also the right thing to do. And I think that sometimes there are problems in life that do not have an obvious solution. As humans, what do we do in those situations? We do the right thing.
Tom?
Well, I think it gets down to the limits to power. I mean, what can the West do to make Putin cooperate on this issue? Aren't they going to respond to his conditions, which frankly are pretty limited and specific? I mean, he's basically saying he doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO and the European Union, and that the ethnic Russians should have minority rights. He's not going to invade Ukraine proper. You often hear this talk from the alarmists in this debate. Mearsheimer, in the aforementioned article in Foreign Affairs, spells out why. But one of the reasons why is that, intriguingly, the broad cross-section of the Russian people don't want an invasion in Ukraine.
Wait a minute, the invasion of Ukraine happened.
Well, you're talking about the eastern Ukrainian parts where the rebels have a stronghold. I'm talking about Kiev.
No,
the
I'm talking
argument
about
of
the
Masha is
invasion
that
of Ukraine.
Okay, but the fact is that has happened because he sees this as a vital strategic interest.
That Putin has, the regular Russian army has been in Ukraine for the last 3 days.
Yes.
It is expanding the area controlled by the so-called rebels who were never rebels in the first place.
Well, he wants to wreck Ukraine until his conditions are met.
No.
That's his point.
He has said many contradictory things about his conditions. He wants to expand.
You think that he would go all the way to Kiev? You think that Putin wants to invade Kiev? Is that what you're really saying?
Putin wants to expand and Putin wants to escalate.
I don't see any evidence for that, and we'll find out in the next year. I think, well, mind you, he might be pushed, but the point is that the West aren't understanding these conditions.
Yeah.
Seriously, if you go to Brussels and Washington, and indeed in Canberra, the narrative is overwhelmingly Marsha's. But there is a complicated counter-argument that I've tried to put forward here that has some logic, and it goes back more than 25 years.
Sir.
I thought it was interesting, Masha, what you said about sanctions, and that while you agree with them, you don't actually see them working. Tom mentioned earlier about how nations, as they increase in wealth, they're more likely to protect their strategic interests, as we see with China. Russia is effectively a petrostate. They don't make anything else. The Russia's influence and power and wealth is uniquely tied to the price of oil. So it seems like economic sanctions can be uniquely effective against the Russian regime. What is it that you think about economic sanctions that can't affect some kind of political change?
Before you go to Masha, it's, yes, a petrostate, but a petrostate that a lot of Europe relies on. I think that is significant to remember with the sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely, and that makes, that puts a limit on the sanctions, and that puts a limit on Europe's ability to threaten Putin. Not that it's been particularly strident about doing that, but I don't think it's right to compare Russia to China, which has been a rational actor for a long time. And by rational, I mean, from the Western point of view, it seems to pursue its interests in a way that makes perfect sense. It is much more useful to compare Russia right now, for example, to Iran. Russia is a country that is in the midst of a major cultural transformation, a major turning back in terms of its cultural mores. It is willing to sacrifice a lot to allow that new ideology and that new national identity to take hold.
Just to clarify, you're saying the sanctions would have to be much more biting than what the West is willing to do?
No, I'm saying the sanctions will not work to change Putin's course.
Tom,
nothing will.
The question with sanctions is often not how much damage it inflicts, but how much damage the country is prepared to endure. In this case, how much is Putin prepared to endure?
A lot, because it's a vital strategic interest. And sorry for sounding like the pub bore, but great powers do fight tooth and nail to protect their vital interests. So this will hurt Russia, but it will also hurt Western Europe. And there is already evidence to indicate that some countries in Western Europe are keen for the sanctions, for the West to step back, to change track, and seriously ponder the Kissinger-Mearsheimer Switzer thesis.
It's been a terrific discussion.
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships to continue our work. Donations can be made via the Festival of Dangerous Ideas website. Thank you.